Hello, and welcome to Abstract Essence, the podcast where I ask people the question, what is art? I'm your host, Michael Pearson, and on today's episode, we are visited by Natasha Guy, an amazing artist who works with quite a few different mediums, but primarily collage photography and film. She used to work for an amazing spot here in Philadelphia called Paradigm Gallery. And actually, the only time I had the pleasure of visiting was for a show that Natasha organized herself before moving to Paris, where she pretty much seems to be living out every young artist's dream. Did I miss anything?
No, I think you just about nailed it. That was kind of nice to hear.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. I actually don't really know too much about your move to Paris and what you've been up to and what you do there. So I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so it's actually been, I was just looking at a calendar recently, 7 months since I moved here, which was crazy because I've lived in Philadelphia my whole life. Yeah, I moved here to do my master's in art history at the Sorbonne, which I've been doing. And I've also been interning now at a photography agency. And it's been definitely exciting to see sort of where I'm going. I'm maybe moving out of Paris for a little bit to another part of France later in the year.
Ooh.
So yeah, just keeping a lot of options open, but it's been a good 7 months.
So yeah, this gig you have with the photography, you said it's a photography studio?
It's a photography agency. So I work in the archives and the editorial department, writing like texts for photographers and translating captions. Yeah, the agency basically works to promote and sell the photographers that are represented by the agency to newspapers or books or whatever it may be, or even like public grant money, because that's really the great thing about France. And part of the reason that I moved here is that the government is really good about giving people, and like artists specifically, funding and money. And that's like pretty unique to France compared to the US.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like, we definitely are lacking a bit of that over here. So I want to hear more about this potential move.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been feeling recently, it's funny, this is very new, like the past week.
Okay.
I love Paris and I know I'll be coming back, but I think your early 20s are a really great time to move. And I'm looking at a couple internships or maybe even schools in the south of France. I'm not totally sure yet. I'll be deciding that in the next month or so. But I think February is kind of a feisty month in that way, where a lot is being figured out. And there's so much happening in smaller cities. And as much as Paris is a wonderful city, it can be nice to get some space from it.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. So you've moved there. You've been there for 7 months. I feel like, at least the way that I look at it, a big part of being an artist is networking and community around it and all that kind of stuff. So has that been, challenging in a new place with a second language? Like, what's that been like?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Because I think Paris is, any big city, I think people are really networky, and Paris is obviously like a hub for art and fashion. But the fun thing about Paris is there are a lot of expats. So I'd say I've been really lucky to meet people through friends of friends and meet a variety of creatives. At first I was meeting a lot of fashion people, which is very much not my thing, but it's interesting to learn about.
I agree.
And then you see that, and then more fine arts people, and just seeing even I feel like there are different jobs here. So I'm meeting people that have really interesting jobs. One of my friends is a set designer, and in French we say scénographie. And I guess in English, I think we also say, I don't know if we say scenography. I really don't know, but
that sounds vaguely familiar, but definitely not my specialty.
Yeah, and I feel it's just the world of creatives is a little bit different in France. We even have a different word for artist. You can also say a plasticienne, which is someone who works with their hands. It's plastic arts, les arts plastiques. And so it's just the variety of people here that are doing so many different creative things that I feel I didn't even know about a year ago is really cool.
Yeah.
But the second language thing, French people are a lot nicer than they get credit for, I think. And
oh yeah, that's nice to hear.
And I think people give me slack if ever I'm missing a vocab word, and some things are just better said in English or vice versa better in French. So I think it's been a learning experience for me and the French people that I have made interact with me and become my friends.
Made them, forced them.
I'm let's be your best friends. And they're d'accord, si tu veux.
So I feel if there was, a random French artist that came and introduced herself to all of my friends here in Philly, everyone would probably automatically just be obsessed with her by virtue of just the coming from somewhere else factor. Does that happen to you at all? Are people into the whole foreigner thing?
I think it's been really helpful on like a very practical level for like jobs, because like speak fluent English is still incredibly attractive because like Parisians are pretty good at English, but like obviously speaking English is super practical. But then like interpersonally and I guess like artistically, I think when you're a foreigner, you sort of have this like mystique, and it's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel very American here sometimes, which is interesting because I don't usually feel that way. Yeah. I think I have to be sort of careful with that sometimes because I definitely feel like every once in a while you meet someone and they're like, oh, you're this like American girl. And I'm like, yeah, I guess. I don't know.
I guess I am. Yeah.
I feel like it's more dangerous, like romantically though, than anything else.
Oh, yeah. How so? How so?
I feel like you don't want to just become like an idea of a person in someone's mind, right? And
yeah.
And I'm not like an idea of an American girl. I just am a girl who happens to be American, I guess.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay, actually, yeah, that's a lie. That's not true. No, just kidding. So I want to hear more about before you left Philly. You were working at Paradigm here, the gallery, and I just wanted to know more about that because I didn't talk to you that much about it while you were working there.
Yeah, so I worked at Paradigm I'm really bad at counting those years, but I think it was about 3 years from when I was 19 to right before I turned 22. It's like honestly such an amazing place. And like the owners, Sarah and Jason, really helped like form my future, to put it very simply.
Yeah.
And I like started off part-time as an intern and then like eventually worked there at post-grad as like a gallery assistant and was able to see the evolution of the gallery, but also sort of like my own evolution into adulthood because I mean, I started working there as a literal teenager. And then by the end, I organized like my own show with 11 international artists. So it's like crazy. A moment of like growth that really Jason and Sarah facilitated that I'm super grateful for. And when I was working there, I was able to go to art fairs in New York. And it was just an experience it sort of goes back to, I don't know, my thinking about my current move right now to the south of France. Like you never know when opportunities are going to present themselves. And I think that's the beauty of being in your early 20s and just being open to things is your whole life can change in like a couple of weeks and you don't even realize.
Yeah. That's wild. Oh, wait. So about the show that you put together, how did that start? How did that come into being?
Yeah. So I think we talked about it about a year ahead of time. And Jason and Sarah, the two co-owners, proposed for me to organize and curate a show based around collage because I'd seen my own collage work and they were like, oh, you might be good at figuring this out. I was really excited to work on organizing a show because obviously, I mean, A, it's just like generally a dream, but B, like about a medium that's so like meaningful to me. It was just like a super exciting opportunity. And I was then able to look for artists, reach out to them. And I've actually been able to meet some of them in person because since it was an international show, I couldn't meet everyone, but I've since been able to meet some, which is really exciting. And eventually we set the date for the fourth Friday in June. And the buildup was just really exciting, working on a title, writing a press release, thinking about why collage and just sort of the logistics of it. It was really. And then suddenly I felt like it just happened and I was like, how did we do that? But again, like I really couldn't have done it without Jason and Sarah and the artists in the show and like all my friends who like listen to me talk about it a lot.
Yeah. How'd you actually end up finding those artists and like sourcing them and communicating with them and all that?
This is why I could never delete Instagram, honestly, or at least not yet. Despite its toxic components, is that
I relate to this already.
Yeah, and as much as I'm like, oh, social media sucks, man. Like, yeah, I guess, but also like it's how you hear about so many independent creators, and it gives so many people a platform. So I think it's sort of you have to curate that for what you want. Like, I follow so many artists on Instagram. I like honestly mute a bunch of people, and I just like to look at artists and like what people are up to. Mm-hmm. And so then I reached out to a couple people through Instagram if they didn't have websites, but otherwise I'd find their websites and reach out to them via email and then sort of start a conversation that way. Some people we had phone calls with. That was really fun also. And yeah, I mean, it was also still like very much COVID we're still in COVID now, but COVID when there were restrictions. So thinking about the mail was all messed up. I mean, the mail is still messed up, but the mail was really messed up at that time.
Yeah.
The logistics of navigating all of that and navigating if people got sick, what would the opening look like? How do we host a virtual opening that's still exciting? That sort of thing. But yeah, it kind of just came together in the end. But yes, thankful, unfortunately, for Instagram, I guess.
Yeah, wow. I feel so similarly about Instagram. I tell people that if I wasn't trying to promote my own music and things like that I would just totally get rid of it. But instead, it just sucks me in. And it's just so awful the way that it affects me. But the opportunities.
Yeah, and I feel like even back to your earlier question about like my network in France and like networking with people, so some of that like is Instagram actually, and like people reaching out to you that way, and like even like I guess generally like having an online presence. Like I had a friend ask me to make his album art because he found my website and was like, "Oh, I liked how you did this. Could you do this for me?" And just like simple stuff like that, I guess.
Yeah. So this is actually a different direction than I wanted to go, but I'm curious in terms of commissions and things like that. How do you approach that process in terms of managing the request, feeling if it's like right for you, and also pricing, which I think is super hard?
Yeah, these are good questions. Unfortunately, I'm like a massive people pleaser, so I tend to say yes. I'm working on that though, and I'm getting too busy to do that anyway. So I'm trying to prioritize like my own projects. I think so far I'm still working on like being more like open and willing to collaborate with people, because I think so much of the visual arts as compared to like music, from what I can tell, is like it's so easy to just like make your visual arts a really solitary thing. So I think like working with people on commissions have been a really fun way to do that. And like, but first starting off with like friends, like obviously my friend Nancy Rosenberg, who like asks me to help her with like her album art or whatever project, like that's a lot more comfortable and a first step to then collaborating with someone new. And a lot of the times other people feel uncomfortable giving feedback. I think it's hard. It's a hard thing to do at first for a lot of people, but then it gets easier. Yeah. So for commissions, I guess I just like to talk a lot in general. And then so I like to talk a lot about, I guess, like what people expect, like what specific visual things they want. And I think I can honestly be a little bit difficult to work with because I think I work really intuitively. Like, I don't think it's necessarily like a question of like imagination so much as a question of intuition. And like, so just getting an idea from someone and seeing like what specific visual elements they liked, and then taking space and being like, okay, I'm going to give you a bunch of options. And sometimes I'll work like really intensely, and I think that can sort of overwhelm people, but I'm just kind of an intense person in that way. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of, I guess, like the creative side of things. And like, it's definitely an interesting thing I'm still learning. And then pricing, that's something newly I'm trying to figure out. So good question.
Yeah. It's hard.
Yeah, for a while, all I was thinking was like, okay, you could at least like reimburse me.
Well, like for supplies, you mean?
Yeah, like that was like becoming the bare minimum. Because also I think it's like, so with commission stuff, I feel like you learn so much from it that it's really like a pleasure to do something. So it's hard to be like, okay, now pay me.
Yeah.
And especially if it's for like a friend. But I think slowly what I'm realizing is, I think for friends, you can do certain things for free, but really technical things that you would expect other people to pay you for, that's what your friend should pay you. I think that's sort of my base rule. But pricing sort of, I guess, project dependent. And sometimes recently I'm still really into like bartering. So like, I'll make your album art, but like, can you write me a song then for a project I'm working on?
Yeah, that's a good way to approach it. I love to do stuff like that.
Yeah, because I think it's fun to like, yeah, so I'm like literally doing that right now with someone. And I think that's been like a really fun trade. And then like, but I think it's interesting to see how someone else's project can become sort of your project. If like I'm doing the set design for a friend's video.
Oh, that's cool.
He's writing music for me, whatever. Like it's, yeah. And so it's like, if you're doing something for the first time, I think it's really hard to ask for money besides reimbursement personally. But I think maybe that's also something that's been conditioned in me that, you know, I should be compensated for work.
Yeah. I mean, like as like from the other side of things in terms of music and like all of that stuff, I've done, you know, production, recording, and all these things for different people, and it's so hard. It's so much harder when money enters the mix.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, especially like I think for a lot of people with collaborations and that sort of thing, it's all starting off working with friends, which then like it's like about tainting the relationship and then how much you value your work and all of these different like factors come into play that I agree kind of with what you said a second ago with when other people that you aren't actually as close with start getting involved, then it gives you a bit of perspective.
Yeah.
And For example, like I also, collage artist, which is, why I love to follow you and all your stuff. With my stuff, I would go out to the park over the summer and sell it, kind of like a flea market type situation. I would sell it for so much less than some other artists would sell their stuff. It's a weird, I sell a poster for maybe like $10. Well, someone else could totally sell posters for like $60. And it's like, how much is it, respecting yourself, respecting the value of the work of the artists around you by not undercutting them, but at the same time knowing like, okay, like these collages I make, like I made them all and now I can go print them out for like $1.50 a piece. And so is it really worth selling it for $60 at the same time? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a hard question. I think it's something that's kept sort of intentionally obtuse in the art market. Like just generally a lot of galleries don't have transparent pricing, and it's sort of meant to be confusing and make people feel excluded and like they don't have the skill set to understand it. And like it's funny because even though like I've worked at different like commercial spaces, like commercial art spaces, it's still, I think when you're sort of young, it's sort of hard to know where to position yourself. But I think that comes with time. And I mean, almost everyone I know that's like working in the creative space that's young is doing something on the side and is like trying to make their side hustle their main hustle. But
right.
I think there's a learning curve, and that's why we have the main hustle.
True.
And then, no, literally like once I had a friend who wanted to buy a collage of mine, and he was like, "Oh, how much should I pay you?" And I was like, you don't have to pay me." And he's like, "No, like I'm an artist, you're an artist, like I'm going to pay you for your work." And I was like, "Oh," and that was really an aha moment for me where I was like, this is like a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago now. And I was like,
yeah, I've had the exact same moment with one of my friends who was over here like a couple months ago. And he's a friend who I would just, I just give a poster to because I love him. I give him anything, whatever. And he's like, "Mike, I am not leaving this room with this poster until you tell me how much to Venmo you."
Yeah.
And I was like, you need friends like that. I don't know, because
no, you do.
They are the catalysts at the end of the day for, I think, a lot of self-worth and taking yourself seriously. So I think those important moments are, they're crucial.
And that's also why I think like your network question is so important, because I think like if you find the right like creative friends, or even like I would argue some people become your like creative soulmates, I think that can be incredibly life-changing, because as much as you can take yourself seriously, sometimes you do need, at least I feel that way, I do need someone else to be like, "Hey, Natasha, I think you'd be good at this," and propose it to me. And then I do it and I'm like, "Oh yeah, I'm kind of kick-ass. Like, thank you for reminding me."
Those moments are huge. I mean, it's hard because a lot of it is dependent on confidence and self-worth. And there's so many different things that go into that. But at the end of the day, at least some of that, in my opinion, needs to come from some kind of external source, unless you're just like the absolute most perfect stoic. Because like, there are moments of that are discouraging and need motivation. And I mean, with my song Bedbugs that like got on like the Spotify Fresh Finds playlist like 3 years ago or whatever, at some point along the way, if there wasn't like a moment like that or something similar to that, where it was like some sort of real feeling of a milestone or achievement that came from some sort of external validation of some person sitting in Spotify's basement in New York or whatever, being like, "Yes, this song will be on this playlist for like 1 week." Some random happenstance, and that could take so many different forms, but I feel like those moments of motivation are important to take in and internalize.
I agree. And I think it makes you then more like compassionate to other people, and you want to do that for other people. Or like I had a friend organize a show recently, and I was like, "No, like really, you did amazing." And she was like, "Thank you." And like, because I know like when I had a show, it was really meaningful when people were saying that to me. And I was like, "Oh, I need to make sure that she's understanding how valuable this moment is for her." Like, I think it's nice to sort of build that network, but it does, I think, sometimes take something external, but that external thing can very much be rooted in like chance. But I think that's kind of part of the game and part of the like intuition of just like trusting yourself. And
so I'm curious about, you just mentioned like putting the show together. That what you learned from that as an artist yourself, in terms of kind of seeing it from the opposite side, right? Because you were finding these other artists and sort of like putting them on in a way, and what you learned from that experience for your own practice moving forward, whether that affected you artistically or just the way that you want to, I guess, manage your personal, I guess it's the business of it in terms of getting in galleries and things like that.
Yeah. I think, I mean, from the show and just generally from working at Paradigm. I think like you always want to be reading contracts really well and talking to other people, talking to other artists to know what's fair, because not every gallery is as amazing as Paradigm, and not every gallery is going to treat artists as respectfully as they should. And so you should try to learn as much from other people to know what's normal. Once you know what's normal, know how you feel about that, to know what percentage you're willing to, what percentage you absolutely must have from the sale, etc. And I think, what else did I learn from the artists that way? I mean, I think just seeing all of them talk about their work was really inspiring and moving, because I mean, like, I know how I feel about collage, but it's always nice to have these discussions with other people, and just seeing also like how trusting they were was really amazing, because I'm incredibly anal. So I'm a control freak, so that amazes me. Also just framing is so important. Like whether to frame or not to frame, but just the color frame you get, just everything about it is so important.
I've always been so captivated by framing, actually. I think when I go to a museum, that's one of the things I think about the most.
Yeah, because if there's a bad frame, it can ruin the piece of art, like bad glass.
Yeah.
If there's too much of a matte, I think it can just like...
So who makes that decision?
It depends. Sometimes artists will... I can't speak to every gallery, and I was actually just in the archives at the Pompidou Center, but I can tell you that... Okay, so like in a private setting, I think it depends. Some artists will give you their work framed. Some artists will ask the gallery to help them get it framed. It totally depends. And sometimes you just want it unframed. Personally, I like artwork unframed a lot of the time, but it's like framing is the most personal question. If someone asks you how to frame something, I like don't know how to answer that. It's like, I don't know, like, how do you take your coffee? It's personal. And then,
well said.
And at museums right now, it's interesting. There's totally a push to stop wasting resources and money on buying new frames. So they're trying to buy more standard frames, like a black frame or like a wooden frame in sort of standard sizes. But
that becomes an environmental question. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, exactly. And a lot of museums are starting to think about that. It becomes like an environmental question, definitely, but also like budgeting and like conservation. I think I just met the woman who's in charge of like literally framing the photographs at the Pompidou collection, and it's like her whole job, and she has people working under her. I'm pretty sure it's like pretty intensive because it does make a difference.
That is fascinating. I can't imagine that being my job, framing. Like the things that are out there in the world and the industry are just fascinating to me.
Yeah, you learn, like, I feel like the older I get, the more I learn about jobs that I did not know about. But I think that's exciting, and people making their own jobs. I mean, people who are able to make freelance work for them. I think that's amazing.
I agree. Okay, so pivot here. I'm gonna ask you the question, bring everyone on here to ask, how do you define art?
I don't know. Let me think. Okay. I think art is instinctual.
Elaborate on what you mean by instinctual.
I think working from instinct, it's like when you get into a state of flow when you're working. When you get into a state of flow, you're just like, for me, I'm just working instinctively. I'm like drawn to something I cut like ages ago, and I'm like, oh, I remember cutting this. And now this is the perfect time to put it with here. Or it's like, and it's almost like mindless.
Right.
Because you're just like trusting yourself so much and just like letting go and like letting in.
So it's about that flow state, the things that kind of happen automatically without you thinking about it.
Yeah, but I'm sure so many people would disagree.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everyone like has a very different approach in terms of their process from what I've seen from talking to people. But I wonder then, in terms of your process and your working and all that, do you ever feel like the intellectual part of you sort of like will rub up against or block your artistic flow?
Yeah, I think I definitely am an overthinker also. So like, that's not great. That's why it's hard. You can't force flow, right? And my new thing, I'm very into saying like, faut pas forcer. Like, you shouldn't like force things.
Yeah.
And like, it's like whatever comes easy, maybe that's what you should be doing. I mean, that's not to say you shouldn't work hard, but you shouldn't have to force things to work out, and maybe be open to things right in front of you that you're not paying attention to because you're overthinking things. But I mean, I'm an art history nerd. Like, I like thinking about historical context, and I like things like that. So in that way, I think I don't mind when it brushes up against the flow, but it's hard to like, you can't force yourself to be in a state of flow. I remember I was in a ceramics class. The professor was this like older man who was awesome and could like center two pieces of clay on two separate wheels at the same time, which is a pretty big deal in the clay world. He was like, no, sometimes you wedge all this clay and you start throwing, and you're not going to be able to do anything, and you just have to pack up your clay and leave. I feel that way.
That's great. I agree. Sometimes I sit down and I'm like, okay, I'm going to write a song today. And I sit down, nothing happens. I play my guitar. And then other times I sit down and I'm like, I'm going to write a song today. And it actually happens more rarely than not. But usually it's like I'm doing something else and I get so distracted. I'm like, I just feel like playing my guitar right now. And then I'm supposed to be doing something else. And then I've spent 3 hours and there's like a whole new idea song that I've like developed. And it's just so much on accident almost.
I totally agree. And that's why it's so funny. I feel like sometimes we're all so obsessed with this idea of like being productive and working. But so often I think doing nothing is just as important as like working. Sometimes just like, oh, like I'm going to go on a walk, or like, oh, I'm going to whatever, like not do something like working, and then suddenly you get distracted or something like happens and clicks, and then you're like, and then 5 hours later you're like, how did I just do that? What just happened? It's like almost like a fugue state. Okay,
so when you end up doing any work, whether it's collage or anything else that you do, how do you usually find yourself there doing it? Like what are you usually doing before? Is it like with an intent to do it? Or are you just like blinking and you just realizing that you just were sitting on the floor for 3 hours, cutting things out and gluing them together?
I'm trying to think, because this afternoon I just sort of ended up collaging, even though I had so many other things to do. And sometimes it's like my room, wherever I live, whatever room I'm in, always sort of looks like an explosion of paper, as you've seen. And so sometimes I think I'll just see something and I'll be like, I should go check on that. And then suddenly I'm like checking on that turned into like hours later. Sometimes I will like try, like sort of how you were saying about like sitting down and writing a song. Sometimes I'll be like, I'm going to collage today. And sometimes that works. Like if I have like really a ton of time, or if I'm like really stressed about something else, it's like, oh, let me deal with it this way and process that stress that way.
Yeah.
Which can be really nice also. I'd almost want to like ask my like roommates or something, because you know sometimes other people notice things about you that you don't even realize that you do.
That's true. And sometimes to hear those things hurts, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Maybe I won't ask. Yeah. And also like even like nights I think are really great, but also mornings are. But afternoons aren't. Great. Afternoon art for me is not so possible. Afternoons are for like tea, and then like nights you can do stuff. But I think a lot of creative people are like really productive at night.
I think so too. I was talking to my friend about this recently. I was up in New York playing a show with her, and we were talking about just being like raging insomniacs. And I was like, the best time to write a song, like a lot of my songs come from when I like get in bed and I want to go to sleep and I can't or don't want to. And then I'm like, I'm just going to grab my guitar real quick, light some incense. And then next thing you know, I don't know, there's a new idea. It's pretty fun.
Yeah, I would agree that candles or incense or whatever are sort of an essential part of the flow. But no, I definitely had that happen where I'm like, I objectively have to wake up at 8 a.m., which for me feels very early. And I know that I need 8 hours of sleep, but I will find myself unable to do that because I will get distracted by whatever I like, and then suddenly I'm like, I have to at least write this idea down, and I'm like, but I can't really read my own handwriting that well, or I know that my notes won't make sense to me in the morning, so I'm like, I should just do it now. And then you've ruined your whole sleep schedule for the day and the week. And
I'm glad. I feel so much less alone than I did before in this conversation, because that's how I feel so often. It's like, all right. I could record like another part of the song right now, or try to force myself to go to sleep. But if I record the song, then I'll have a new song. Is that worth the next week and a half of my life being offset by like terrible sleep in my schedule? And then I'm like, yeah, it's worth it. Usually, whatever. Like,
usually it is.
Usually it is.
It's nice when you can like get someone else on sync with you. Like I had like a really good friend visiting me recently, and we could like sync our sleep schedules. Like all of our schedules were synced, so we could like do stuff together, and it was awesome.
That's sweet. Okay, here's a question. In terms of the amount of output, I'm thinking about this because we were just talking about how it's sort of hard to control, in terms of what you're producing. In terms of your output, do you ever put any expectations on yourself in terms of making things?
Very rarely, but recently, yes. I'm working on a short film. It's like 3 minutes with a friend of mine, because we want to submit it to this very specific festival. It's like, because it's shooting on Super 8 film, and it's like a festival for Super 8 film. And there's like a festival deadline. we like have to work within the confines of that. And I think sometimes like pressure is fun. Like when you're like running, like pressure can be really nice, honestly. I think pressure can be like a deadline, and like working with other people. Like my friend whose album cover I'm making, he's like, so I do need that at some point in February. And I'm like, February is a long month. He's like, it's objectively not. It's the shortest month. I'm like, it's fine. It's fine.
That's funny.
I like deadlines. I like that I know that I will be working to the last minute on a deadline, but I will meet the deadline. I think it can be nice. But otherwise, no, I think usually I'm pretty freeform. But I think that's the hard part when you're trying to like monetize though your art, is it's like, are you willing to treat it like your work? Like your like professional work with professional expectations?
Yeah, I relate to that. I think it's about boundaries and compartmentalizing, at least for me, because certain things I will be like, okay, this project is totally free. And then other projects, whether it's under the whole like Slowzy thing or I'm producing for someone else, I'm like, deadline, this is intense, like this is hard, this has to happen by this date, XXXXY, you know, like in terms of all the different things happening. And I think that like the fear for a lot of people, and definitely for me at points, has been like tainting the art with the feeling that comes along with work, in terms of not wanting it to feel like work and then ruining like your happiest outlet that you have in your life, generally speaking. And so it's a weird balance to have to strike.
Yeah, I think it's really not obvious, and I think it's something that's kind of scary, but it's weird because it's kind of like a dream, but then it's also terrifying because you're like, this could ruin me. But I mean, like, I think small, like personal imposed limits, like when my friend was visiting me, we had a bunch of projects we were doing and we had a week.
Yeah.
And I think stuff like that is really fun. But then you have sort of like, I don't know if this is like something you also have, but like, I feel like if I have a really great creative like week or month or like day, and then like you can have sort of a come down.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, that was so great. What if I never get to do that again?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, was that me? I've literally forgotten about projects I've done, and then someone else has had to remind me.
Yeah, I actually really, really relate to this. And I think that part of my process is that I'll work on something, and by the time I put out a song, I usually hate it because I've heard it like 1 billion times, and I've focused on every single aspect of it that I'm trying to make better. So like I'm just focused on all the negative parts of it in a way, as I'm like pushing it towards the release. And then I will like not listen to it and it'll be out of my mind. But like I think the other side of that though is in terms of the forgetting where it came from and like feeling like it was a different version of you in the past that made it, that you can't even understand how you made it. It makes me appreciate some of the things I do a lot more too. I listen to a song I wrote and I'll be like, this is awesome. Like I can honestly appreciate it, and also be like, I couldn't write this like right now. Like, I don't know.
I totally agree. I think especially like COVID, like graduating college in the pandemic and then like living in Philly and having a lot of space in my apartment and but not seeing people because of COVID, and just like the time that I had to make stuff was so crazy. And I look back and I'm like, how did I do that? Like I like it feels almost like an outer body experience, because then now like with like rules loosening and stuff, and it's like, I mean, like I just moved to another country, so I have like other things that I figure out, and like school and job and whatever, and I'm like, who did that? That's awesome. Go her.
Yeah. For me, the time of intense quarantine was definitely akin to a cocoon.
Yes, but even this past week, I went to a bunch of openings in Paris. It's so funny. I keep saying I'm like about to butterfly in February, but even I went to a bunch of openings this week, and so many like paintings were of like cocoons, or like, did you say chrysali? Like chrysalises?
I wish I knew.
I just feel like I've seen cocoons everywhere at different art shows, and it's just, but it's exciting because I feel like everyone's about to burst.
This is exciting. I think that, you know, if we look at, you know, humanity as in culture as like this broad scale, which I have no authority to talk about whatsoever, I think that everyone was forced to, as a species, essentially be way more confined than they usually are. And I feel like on a global scale like that, usually in no particular way are we all on the same page. So I think that it definitely will result in some sort of cultural explosion in the future.
Yeah, it's like kind of crazy, and I think it's just changed so many people in such a fundamental way. Like I've become such an introvert, which is great. I love it. But I think so many people have just been taking the time for themselves and like working on their art. And I love this idea of your idea of like a cultural explosion. I totally see that. I think it's like kind of unpredictable but exciting.
It's all that joint trauma, just the humanities, just one big joint traumatic experience. And now we can not only all make art about it, but we can also have everybody else relate to it in some way, which is kind of interesting.
Sometimes I still feel like I could just wake up in February 2020. Like those memories just don't feel distant at all, but I feel like we're in a totally different world now. It's like insane.
Yeah, it really does feel that way. Okay, we're kind of running up on time here. So before we close out, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to mention anything else you might want to mention or promote anything you might be working on or anything you're excited about.
I'm working on figuring out how to make a collage video.
Oh.
Like kind of stop motion-y collage. I don't totally have the specifics yet. Yes, I think that's going to disrupt my sleep habit in a really nice way. So I'm looking forward to that immensely.
Nice.
Yeah, but otherwise, yeah, just lots of little projects like that coming up. So I think that's sort of a bigger one, but lots of little projects coming up, which is nice. And hopefully everyone will be seeing a move from me soon.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. I mean, I personally am very excited to see that. I love to see mediums collide like that. So that'll be very exciting. All right. Well, thanks for coming on. Really appreciated having you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And to anyone out there listening and or watching, thanks for swinging through, and we'll catch you next time.